I'm doing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
All right, so confession. I don't know anybody who's starts off all that excited about confession. I mean,
Good times.
yeah, we have never sat around and said, hey, why don't we invite some friends over Saturday night and do some of that? You know, it's like this is.
Nobody's coming over anymore.
It's like not something we typically choose. And in that respect, it's like a lot of spiritual practices, I think. It doesn't sort of fit naturally, normally into our ordinary lives. We have to work it. We have to do it. Confession is something you do. It's not an idea. It's not, it's a spiritual practice. And I mean, there's all kinds of good reasons why we don't just kind of do it instinctively, normally. Confession is something you do. Well, I guess it's a kind of truth-telling. You could put it in that category, but it's a very special kind of truth-telling. It's the kind of thing that's appropriate to do when you've hurt somebody else or hurt yourself. That's when all of a sudden it becomes confession. So it's kind of what surfaces in consciousness first is all kinds of reasons not to do this. It's like, you know, I'm trying to look okay here. I'm embarrassed by this, or I want to, you know, start the confession with a long story about how unusual it is for me need to do this, you know, because normally I'm just a straight up guy, and this is the exception rather than the rule. Or, you know, if we're carrying a lot of shame around with us, like most of us do, you kind of lean into confession, and it feels like everything that's wrong with the planet comes back to me somehow. It's what grandiosity looks like when you're starting to learn how to do confession. It feels like everything's my fault. One of the strengths of 12-step process is that it puts confession into a healthy context. So it's not sort of standing there all by itself. You have to and in fact, the 12 steps don't use the word confession. It talks about admitting stuff a lot, which is functionally the same thing, I think, in many ways. But you do a fourth step before you do a fifth step, and that means you do a lot of hard work to figure out what I'm responsible for and what I'm not responsible for. And confession's the way you respond to the stuff that you're responsible for. And that's never clear at the beginning, what I'm responsible for and what I'm not responsible for. It just takes me forever to sort that kind of stuff out, because I'll either want to take no ownership at all over this problem, like this isn't about me, this is, even if I'm angry, my first experience of anger is you made me angry. It's like, it's not about me, it's about something you did. And so there's a kind of disowning of affect there. This is not about me, nothing for me to confess here. You got stuff to confess, and it takes some hard work, some paying attention to figure out, yeah, I got a stake in here. There's something on my side of the street, and confession is a part of a bigger process. It's the part of the process where we, having taken ownership of the part of the problem that's my problem, we put that into words and say it out loud. And I've just not gotten to the place where that feels good. I don't think it's a practice that you can expect to feel sort of immediately better. You usually feel worse. It's like the truth's out now. I can't hide now behind anything. It's like,
there goes my stock value.
Yeah, the stock value is going down. I'm caught. Somebody knows this now, and again, there's some wisdom there in doing confession. Choosing carefully who we confess to. 12 Steps, again, provides a really wonderful structure for that. It's where you do your first admission to somebody that you've chosen carefully and has done a lot of confessional work themselves, which makes a huge difference. None of us, I think, are going to tell the truth about the stuff we're responsible for unless we have a safe place to do that. So confession is a really community project. It's after we find ourselves in a place full of people that we know will not add to our shame because of this, that we find ourselves able to even try this.
And where are those communities?
Yeah, well, they're kind of hard to find safe places sometimes. Even, there's plenty of people that are not safe to confess to. There's plenty of communities where it's not safe or appropriate to confess. So part of the hard work of confession, I think, is sort of finding spaces where dangerous spiritual practices like that are safe to do. And we all start small with this, and sort of baby steps in spiritual processes, taking a little piece. We can't say everything at once, but you have to start somewhere.
This is for recovery people, not for like normal people?
No, there's completely different between. No, this is sort of certainly the biblical text presents confession as a normal part of the Christian life. This is just something we do. This is something we value. It's not. You don't have to wait until you got something big to confess. Just you become a confessional people, and this is part of the sort of normative practice of life together. We just have this, and that's hard. A lot of places are not like that. A lot of churches are, how are you, fine, thank you kind of places. The last place that you would. I often tell a story of a friend of mine who went to his AA home group on a Thursday night, and a friend came up afterwards and said, "How you doing?" And he told him, he said, it was kind of a hard week. This happened. They talked a bit, and then he went home. Then he goes to church on Sunday morning, and a friend of his comes up after the service on Sunday morning and says, "How are you?" And he said, "I'm fine, thanks. How are you?" And that's the difference between what it feels like to be in a confessional culture and a culture that has lost a sensibility about how to do that in helpful ways. I've seen confession done in the Christian context in very unhelpful ways. The truth is that the first time I saw the spiritual practice of confession done in a way that I thought actually helped people was the first time I went to a 12-step group. I remember sitting there watching people go around in a circle and sort of tell the truth about stuff. And I kind of knew in my brain that's what confession was. But I'd been in the Christian community all my life. I'd never seen that done. I'd seen some confession done in ways to increase shame, but I'd never seen it done in a way that people seemed like this was giving them some traction in life. It was helping them move past something and move forward somehow. And I was just kind of stunned. I didn't. It took me a long time to sort that piece out. Sort of the tragedy of how the Christian community lost confession as a spiritual practice. There's a long story there we don't need to go to. Maybe some examples. I struggled to come up with examples for to talk about today, and I settled on one. This comes from a period, probably the most painful period of my life. It was at least the most painful period of my adult life. My son had just started his career as a drug addict and wasn't getting any help yet. And the abuse of my childhood had floated to the top, and the abuse in my wife's childhood had finally floated to the top. So we were early 40s, mid 40s, and it felt like the stuff had really hit the fan in our lives. We were a mess. Our marriage was falling apart. We couldn't seem to get on the same side of things. We did go to therapy, and we just worked really hard in therapy. It was grueling, and I remember feeling like this isn't going to work. And there's often a moment like that in the therapeutic process where it just feels like you can't get there from here. And that's where I was. I just felt like we'd been working so hard for so long and we're just stuck. And I remember one day in therapy saying, I can't do this. It's too painful. And I look back on that and I think that's one of the more important confessions I've made in my entire life. It did not feel good. It felt like I should be able to make this work. A lot hinges on me being able to make this work. I can't do it. So you have all that kind of shame that comes with powerlessness, which a lot of us experience. But saying that out loud changed something. I'm still not very articulate about it. But as I look back on things now, many years later, it was that moment when I really got to the end of my resources, where things changed. And I didn't expect that. I expected the worst. Now that I couldn't do it, I thought the narrative was coming to an end, you know. I had no conscious awareness at the time that it's just precisely the kind of time when God likes to show up the most. And when you get to the end of your own resourcefulness, there's still stuff possible because God hasn't gotten to the end of God's resources. But to me, it's kind of one of the moments when I think, how does confession make a difference? I see it there. It was, you know, for sure it was what in AA they call ego deflation at depth. It was like coming to the end of things, can't do this. And there was no cheerful edge to that. There was no optimistic edge to that. I was clueless about other possibilities that I certainly didn't think I'd look back on that later and say, holy smokes, that's where you want God most to be. That's where God shows up, in that kind of moment of powerlessness and hopelessness. But that's what actually happened. Looking back on it, I can see that my participation in the change that needed most to happen was coming to the end, saying I can't do this, it's too painful. And that's hard to sell, isn't it? I mean, it's hard to...
Confession seems like it's part of punishment, not something that
Yeah.
waters the soil for transformation.
Yeah. It seems like confession, certainly when you haven't practiced it, when it hasn't become sort of integrated into one's life, which is the goal, it just feels like something you have to do, or maybe it feels like something you should do, or something like that. And that kind of confessional practice, I think, rarely looks pretty after a while. Because it's about compliance, or it's sort of like you have to or should. And the confession that comes out of that, well, I remember watching my son's early efforts to teach, sort of help our grandchildren with moral development. So maybe back when my grandson was 8 and my granddaughter was 4, my grandson takes a toy away from my granddaughter, and she starts to cry, and you know, it's that righteous indignation kind of cry. And Jonah took my toy and all that. And so what any parent does with kids that age, you say,
Go to your room. Be quiet.
give her back the toy and tell her you're sorry. So Jonah, being a normal person, says sorry. You know, it's reluctant. It's at the surface of things. It's not an inappropriate way for kids that age to start learning the spiritual practice of confession. But if you're doing that kind of sorry when you're an adult, it's like something got lost along the way. It's just, or if you get stuck in contrition, sort of feeling bad, like confession is the way you prepare for contrition is to feel bad about yourself. That's kind of a dead end too for confession. That doesn't work. You just wind up feeling bad and then feeling worse and feeling awful, and that makes it harder to really do confession. There's no way to feel bad enough to get to the kind of thing confession's supposed to be. It's like, the prodigal headed home. He'd done a lot of stuff to hurt his dad, and he's just doing I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy all the way home. That's his self-talk is all about that. And it turns out that's got nothing to do with how the Father feels about him. The Father's just scanning the horizon, waiting for an opportunity to do love, and that's really the kind of world we live in. We live in a world where you tell the truth about the stuff that's hardest to tell the truth about, and the consequences are just the opposite of what you expect at the time. The prodigal expected he would come back and confess, and humiliate himself, and he would live a life of humiliation, but he'd have something to eat. And you get back there, and you're an honored guest at the party.
Pretty good meal.
Yeah, pretty good meal, but I'm guessing it took him a long time to sort that out. How come he sort of thought he had a plan, he had it nailed down, he's gonna just be a servant, and his father had a bigger deal in mind. And
we're still trying to sort that out.
Yeah, we're still trying to sort that out. I had a really powerful experience recently. I went to give a talk at Asbury Seminary about recovery, and the Methodists who see this will, if any, will get this. I had a genuine Wesleyan experience sitting in the Wesley Chapel at Asbury Seminary, and I'd been reading the biblical text about Jesus' baptism. And it's this really dramatic text. The heavens open, there's these doves, and Charlton Heston's voice. It says, the way it is in King James is, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." And most commentators on this text sort of approach that as Christological text. It's about some information about who Jesus is. And I think myself that it's, well, it may be that as well. It's really God the Father saying the kinds of things that God says to everybody in his family. It's kind of everyday thing. He says, I love this kid like crazy, and he really makes me happy. And that's not what we expect when we do confession, to hear God say, I love this kid like crazy. He really makes me happy. But that's the deal in God's family. Now, most of us come from families where we got nothing like that. I never heard either of my parents ever in their entire lives say those words. I had no sense of that internally. Anything you got, you had to earn, and it wasn't a way to earn very, very much. So I'm sitting there in Wesley Chapel, and my dad had died 4 years previously. And honest to God, I had this brief, complete out of the blue vision of the heavens opening. And I saw my dad standing beside Jesus.
Awesome.
And what he says is, I love this kid like crazy. He really makes me happy. And I was really moving. I didn't know how to make sense out of it. But it was, I think, my dad saying something that he couldn't say in his lifetime. It was a very confessional sense to it. It was like, I know I couldn't say this. Now I get it. And it felt to me like a small but very personalized insight into what it's like to be part of God's family. That's the deal. Those of us who have no family, who have been orphaned, whether physically orphaned or psychologically orphaned, are invited into a family where God says, I really love this kid, and he makes me happy. And I think we're all in need of that. And we don't initially think that confession will be the way in which that'll come clear, but it's just like when we're afraid, we're pretty sure if we tell God we're afraid, that God's going to say, snap at it, you shouldn't be afraid, there's nothing to worry about.
Memorize some verses. Bro.
Memorize some verses and pray harder or something like that. And we don't anticipate that God will come and be with us. You know, all those texts about don't be afraid in the Bible, it's all, don't be afraid, I'll be with you. So we don't expect that I'm going to stick it out with you however long it takes, peace, to be there. And so confessing our fears leads us to a place where we can experience God's presence. Confessing our shame leads us to a place where we might be able to hear God say, I love this kid like crazy. He makes me happy. All the stuff that is hardest to say takes us to a place of blessing, really. And that's what the spiritual practice of confession is like. Now, God knows that the Christian community has screwed up the spiritual practice of confession in every way it can possibly be screwed up over the years. But I think that the goal of it is still that it's a means of blessing, that it's an occasion where God comes close and pronounces blessing. And you have a new way of experiencing God's love and God's presence. And right at the point where we need it the most, when we're telling the truth about the stuff that's hardest to tell the truth about, that's where we need God to show up the most. Let's sing hymn number 253. I'm getting sermonic, so maybe we're done, dude.